My MIL tried to destroy my marriage. She didn't see this coming. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell icon for upcoming more interesting videos.
My name is Olivia Grant. I am 30 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon, a city filled with rain, quiet streets, and the peaceful rhythm of people who value simple and meaningful lives. My story began several years ago when I met my husband Daniel at a small community event near the river where local
This all
artists
looks
and
absolutely
businesses
wonderful.
gathered every
It really
weekend.
does. Shall we
Daniel
begin?
was kind, thoughtful, and
let's
calm
eat.
in a way that
This zucchini
made
is
people
so
feel
fresh.
comfortable
It looks
around
great.
him. Our
Perfect for the
relationship
pasta.
grew
You're a
naturally
pro
through
at this.
long conversations,
So the main
shared
theory
walks
suggests a
through the
direct
city
correlation.
parks,
Right,
and the
but
simple
what about these
joy of
outliers?
discovering
Let's
how
check the data
similar
in
our
chapter
values
5.
were. We
This market is incredible.
both believed
Yeah,
in
it's one of
building
my
a stable
favorites.
life
Oh,
based
what's
on
that over there?
respect,
Let's go
patience,
see.
and trust.
I know
And
it's
for a
difficult,
long
but you're
time,
stronger than
everything
you
about
think.
our relationship
Thank you.
felt
That means
balanced
a lot.
and genuine
We're
when
here for
Daniel
you.
eventually introduced me
This
to
is
his
wonderful. I'm so glad we're all here.
family. I felt
It's
hopeful
lovely,
because
dear.
I believed that the people who raised such a kind man would welcome the person he chose to build a life with. However, from the very first meeting, I noticed a
What? Are you
subtle
serious? When did this
distance
happen?
in the way his mother
Okay,
Linda
I'm on my way.
interacted with me. She remained polite and courteous, but
I
her
was just
tone
thinking
carried
about
a
the
quiet
past.
coldness
And
that I could
now?
not
Now I
easily
have everything I
explain at
need
the
right
time.
here.
I convinced myself that perhaps she simply needed time to become comfortable with the idea that her son was beginning a new chapter of his life. Families sometimes need time to adjust to change, and I believed patience would allow the relationship to grow naturally. After Daniel and I became engaged, the interactions with Linda became more frequent as we planned the wedding and began organizing our future together. During these moments, her comments often carried small criticisms that seemed harmless on the surface but slowly created an uncomfortable atmosphere. She questioned the choices I made about work, the way I organized certain plans, and even the small details of how Daniel and I arranged our home whenever others were present. She maintained a friendly attitude that made it difficult to respond to those remarks without appearing overly sensitive. Yet the pattern became clear to me because the same type of comments appeared again and again, always subtle, always disguised as concern, but always leaving me with the sense that she believed I was somehow not the right person for her son. Daniel rarely noticed these interactions because they often happened during quiet moments when conversations were private, and I never wanted to create unnecessary tension between him and his family, so I continued treating Linda with respect, hoping that kindness and patience would eventually soften the distance between us. After the wedding, Daniel and I settled into married life with the same warmth that had defined our relationship from the beginning. We built routines together, shared responsibilities, and supported each other through the challenges that naturally come with starting a new household. However, Linda's presence remained constant through regular visits, phone calls, and suggestions about how we should manage different aspects of our lives. Sometimes she offered advice about household decisions, other times she asked Daniel questions that seemed to compare our choices with the way she believed things should be done. While none of these actions were openly hostile, they slowly created a quiet pressure that began surrounding our marriage like a cloud that never fully disappeared. I noticed that Daniel occasionally repeated certain opinions during our discussions, opinions that sounded strangely similar to the concerns Linda had expressed earlier. This pattern made me wonder whether the conversations happening between them were influencing the way he viewed our relationship. The thought unsettled me because I trusted Daniel deeply, yet the growing number of small misunderstandings between us seemed too consistent to be coincidence. Instead of reacting emotionally, I decided to observe the situation more carefully, paying attention to the timing of certain disagreements and the topics that appeared suddenly in our conversations. Little by little, the pattern became clearer. Many of the doubts or questions Daniel raised echoed the same criticisms Linda had quietly directed toward me in the past. Realizing this did not immediately lead me to confrontation because I understood that conflict with a mother-in-law can easily damage the balance of a marriage. Instead, I focused on maintaining calm communication with Daniel while watching how the situation continued to develop. The more I paid attention, the more I sensed that Linda's influence over our relationship was deeper than I originally believed, and although everything still appeared normal on the surface, a quiet realization began forming in my mind. The tension I felt during those early meetings with her may not have been simple discomfort at all, but the beginning of something far more intentional, something that slowly and carefully threatened to place doubt between two people who had once trusted each other completely. After Daniel and I settled into our married life, the routines we created together at first felt calm and steady. Our small home in Portland slowly became a place filled with shared habits, quiet evenings, and simple plans for the future. We both worked hard during the day and spent our evenings cooking dinner together, talking about our goals and enjoying the peaceful rhythm of a life that felt balanced and supportive. However, Linda's presence never truly faded from our daily lives. She called Daniel frequently and visited often, sometimes bringing small gifts or offering help with things around the house, and on the surface these actions seemed thoughtful and caring, yet beneath that polite behavior there was always a subtle pressure that slowly began shaping the atmosphere around our marriage. She often asked Daniel detailed questions about our routines, how we managed our finances, how we divided responsibilities, and how certain decisions were made. Whenever these conversations happened, I noticed that Daniel sometimes returned from them with new concerns or suggestions that had never been part of our discussions before. At first, I believed this was simply normal family involvement, because many parents remain interested in their children's lives even after marriage. But over time, the pattern became difficult to ignore. Small misunderstandings between Daniel and me started appearing more frequently, and many of them seemed connected to opinions that Linda had quietly introduced earlier. These disagreements were never dramatic, but they created moments of confusion where both of us wondered how such small issues could suddenly become points of tension. I remained careful not to accuse anyone or create unnecessary conflict, because I understood how easily family disagreements can grow into something much larger. Instead, I focused on observing the situation with patience while continuing to communicate openly with Daniel about our feelings. The more I paid attention, the more I noticed that many of the ideas influencing our disagreements echoed the same criticisms Linda had expressed toward me in the past. Sometimes Daniel questioned decisions I made about work or responsibilities in ways that sounded almost identical to the concerns she had raised during previous visits. Hearing those words come from him felt strange, because the man I married had always respected my independence and supported my ambitions, yet now those same qualities were occasionally presented as problems that needed adjustment. Despite these moments, our relationship still contained the same foundation of trust and care that had brought us together, which made me even more determined to handle the situation carefully rather than allowing frustration to damage the connection. Daniel and I shared one afternoon while organizing documents on the desk in our living room. I came across something unexpected that made me pause. It was a small notebook Daniel occasionally used for reminders and schedules, and as I moved it aside, a folded piece of paper slipped out onto the table. I had no intention of searching through his belongings, but the paper had already opened, slightly revealing a list of notes written in handwriting that was clearly not his. The words described concerns about certain aspects of our marriage and suggested ways Daniel could improve communication and decision-making within the relationship. Reading those lines immediately felt unsettling, because the tone sounded less like general advice and more like instructions designed to influence how he viewed our life together. The handwriting looked familiar, and after a moment I realized it matched the careful, neat style I had seen in several notes Linda had written during family gatherings. The discovery did not provide absolute proof of anything, but it revealed enough to confirm a growing suspicion that the advice Daniel had been receiving from his mother was far more detailed and deliberate than I originally believed. The realization forced me to face a difficult truth: someone who should have supported our marriage might actually be guiding it in a direction that created distance rather than unity. Instead of reacting with anger, I placed the paper back exactly where I found it and spent the rest of the evening thinking about how carefully the situation needed to be handled because confronting Daniel without understanding the full picture could create confusion rather than clarity, yet ignoring the discovery was no longer possible as the quiet night settled. Over the house, one thought continued returning to my mind: the tension surrounding our marriage was not accidental, and if I wanted to protect the relationship Daniel and I had built, I would need to understand exactly how far Linda's influence had already reached before deciding what to do next. After discovering the notes that revealed how much influence Linda might be trying to have over marriage, I began paying even closer attention to the small details that surrounded our family interactions. I did not want to rush into accusations because I knew that doing so without clear understanding could damage the trust Daniel and I had always shared. Instead, I chose patience and observation, focusing on the way conversations unfolded whenever we spent time with his relatives. During those gatherings, I noticed something that slowly confirmed my concerns. Certain family members began treating me differently than they had before. Their behavior was still polite, but it carried a quiet distance that had never existed during the early years of my relationship with Daniel. Some of them asked subtle questions about my work, my choices, and the way Daniel and I organized our life together. The tone of those questions suggested that they had already formed opinions based on information that did not fully reflect reality. At first, I wondered if I was simply imagining the shift, but the pattern, repeated often enough to become impossible to ignore it, gradually became clear that Linda had been sharing her perspective about me with others in the family, presenting her concerns as if they were observations meant to protect her son. These conversations had slowly planted small doubts about my character and intentions among relatives who trusted her judgment because of her role within the family. None of this was done openly or aggressively, which made the situation even more complicated because every comment sounded reasonable when taken alone, yet together they created a quiet narrative that painted me as someone who might not be the best partner for Daniel. Realizing this could have easily pushed me toward anger or confrontation, but I understood that reacting emotionally would only strengthen the idea that I was the source of conflict. Instead, I focused on maintaining the same calm, respectful attitude I had always shown toward his family. I continued participating in gatherings, helping when needed, and speaking honestly about my life and goals without attempting to defend myself against rumors that had never been openly expressed. My hope was that by allowing people to see my actions consistently over time, the difference between the stories being shared and the reality of my character would slowly become visible to them. This approach required patience because change rarely happens quickly in situations where misunderstandings have already taken root. Meanwhile, my relationship with Daniel remained strong even though the subtle tensions created by outside influence still appeared occasionally during our conversations. Whenever those moments happened, I chose to communicate openly about my feelings without blaming anyone directly, focusing instead on the importance of trust and mutual respect within our marriage. Daniel listened carefully during those discussions, and although he did not immediately recognize the full extent of what his mother might be doing, I could see that he valued the honesty we shared, which gave me hope that the truth would eventually reveal itself without forcing him to choose between loyalty to his family and commitment to his wife. The opportunity for that truth to surface arrived during a large family gathering held at Linda home, where relatives from different parts of the city came together for dinner and conversation. The house was filled with familiar voices, laughter, and the busy energy that often surrounds family events. As the evening progressed, several discussions naturally turned toward relationships, careers, and the choices people make while building their lives. During one of these conversations, a relative mentioned something about the challenges Daniel and I supposedly faced in our marriage, a comment that clearly reflected the same concerns Linda had quietly shared with others. Instead of reacting defensively, I calmly described the life Daniel and I had built together, the way we supported each other through work responsibilities and personal goals, and the respect that had always been the foundation of our relationship. My words were not intended to confront anyone, but simply to share the truth of our experiences in a natural and sincere way. As the discussion continued, I noticed that some relatives began looking thoughtful, as if comparing what they were hearing now with the impressions they had previously formed. Slowly, the atmosphere of the room changed, and the quiet narrative that once seemed accepted without question began losing its certainty. In that moment, I realized something important. Patience had created the space for reality to speak for itself, and the gathering that once felt like another stage for hidden criticism was now becoming the moment when those hidden doubts started to unravel in front of everyone, including the one person whose understanding mattered most, Daniel himself. The family gathering continued through the evening with the comfortable noise of relatives sharing stories, laughter, and food. Yet beneath the friendly atmosphere, something important had already begun to shift. The earlier conversation about relationships and life choices had quietly opened a door that allowed people to reconsider the impressions they previously held about my marriage with Daniel. I continued behaving naturally, helping in the kitchen, speaking kindly with relatives, and participating in conversations the same way I always had, because my goal was never to prove anything aggressively, but simply to allow people to see the reality of who I was through consistent actions. As time passed, more discussions unfolded among the family, and several relatives asked thoughtful questions about my work, my daily life, and the goals Daniel and I had been building together. I answered honestly, describing the balance we had created in our marriage, the responsibilities we shared, and the support we gave each other while pursuing our individual ambitions. The sincerity of those explanations seemed to create quiet moments of reflection among the people listening, because the life I described did not resemble the subtle doubts that had previously been circulating through the family. Linda remained present throughout these conversations, moving between guests with the same composed confidence she usually carried, yet I noticed small signs of tension in the way she listened. Whenever Daniel or I spoke about our relationship, there were moments when she attempted to redirect discussions toward different topics or emphasize the challenges that married couples sometimes face. But the atmosphere of the gathering had already begun changing in a way she could not easily control. The more openly Daniel and I spoke about our partnership, the clearer it became to others that our relationship was based on cooperation, respect, and trust rather than the concerns that had been quietly suggested in the past. At one point during the evening, a relative mentioned the advice Daniel sometimes received about how he should manage certain aspects of married life. The comment seemed harmless on the surface, but it brought attention to the influence Linda had often placed on his decisions. Daniel paused thoughtfully after hearing this and began reflecting aloud about the guidance he had been given over time. While speaking, he slowly realized that some of those suggestions had created unnecessary doubts about situations that were never truly problems between us. The realization did not arrive suddenly, but through a gradual comparison between the peaceful life we actually lived together and the concerns that had been repeatedly introduced from outside the marriage. As he continued reflecting, the room grew quieter, because the connection between those outside opinions and the tension they created was becoming clear to everyone present, including Daniel himself. He looked at me with a thoughtful expression that revealed he was beginning to understand the pattern that had influenced many of our earlier disagreements. The patience I had practiced for so long was finally allowing the truth to appear naturally without accusations or arguments. When Linda noticed the direction the conversation was taking, she attempted to explain her actions as simple concern from a mother who wanted the best for her son, yet the explanations sounded different now that the family had heard both perspectives side by side. The contrast between her concerns and the reality of our marriage had become visible in a way that words alone could no longer hide. Daniel remained calm during the discussion, but his tone carried a new clarity as he acknowledged that while advice from family can be valuable, it should never create doubt within a relationship that has always been built on trust. Hearing him say this brought a quiet sense of relief, because it showed that he was beginning to recognize the difference between supportive guidance and interference that slowly undermines Confidence. The evening continued after that moment, but the atmosphere had permanently changed. The subtle narrative that once surrounded our marriage had lost its influence, and the family members who previously held quiet doubts now looked at our relationship with a new understanding. For Linda, the situation became difficult to control because the patience that once allowed her suggestions to shape the conversation had now allowed the truth to rise above them. And as the gathering slowly came to an end, it was clear that the events of that evening had created a turning point, not only in how the family viewed our marriage, but also in how Daniel himself understood the importance of protecting the trust we had always shared together. After the family gathering ended and Daniel and I returned home, the quiet of the evening felt very different from the tension that had once surrounded many of our conversations. The events that unfolded during the gathering had allowed several important truths to become visible, not through conflict or accusations, but through patience and honest communication. Daniel spent a long time reflecting on everything he had heard and realized during that night. The difference between the life we actually shared and the doubts that had been quietly introduced into our marriage had finally become clear to him. Over the following days, we talked openly about how outside opinions had influenced some of our earlier misunderstandings and how important it was for us to protect the trust that had always been the foundation of our relationship. Daniel acknowledged that although his mother likely believed she was acting out of concern, her actions had created unnecessary tension between us and had slowly encouraged him to question situations that never truly required doubt. Hearing him recognize this truth brought a sense of relief because it confirmed that the strength of our marriage came from our ability to communicate honestly even when the circumstances around us became complicated. Together, we decided that the future of our relationship needed clearer boundaries with anyone whose involvement might disrupt the balance we had worked so hard to build. This did not mean cutting his mother out of our lives, but it meant redefining the role she would have in our decisions. Daniel spoke with her calmly during the next visit, explaining that while he appreciated her care and concern, the direction of our marriage would always be shaped by the understanding between the two of us rather than outside influence. This conversation was not dramatic or confrontational, but it carried a firmness that had never been expressed before. Linda's reaction was quiet and reserved because she had likely never expected Daniel to address the situation so directly. For years, her suggestions and guidance had slowly shaped the narrative within the family, but now the reality of our marriage stood clearly in front of everyone, including her. The following weeks brought a noticeable change in the atmosphere surrounding our interactions. Family gatherings became calmer, and the subtle criticisms that once appeared during conversations slowly faded. Linda still maintained a polite distance at times, but the influence she once held over the direction of our relationship no longer existed. Daniel and I focused on strengthening the routines and trust that had always made our partnership strong. We spent more time discussing our future goals, supporting each other through work and personal growth, and appreciating the quiet stability that comes from knowing both partners stand firmly on the same side of the relationship. Occasionally, I reflected on how easily the situation could have turned into constant arguments or permanent resentment if I had chosen to react with anger during the early stages. Instead, patience had allowed the truth to emerge naturally, giving Daniel the space to recognize the problem without feeling forced to defend anyone. The lesson I carried from the experience was not simply about dealing with a difficult mother-in-law, but about understanding how trust, communication, and boundaries protect a marriage from outside pressure. The person who once tried to create distance between us had unintentionally revealed the strength of the connection Daniel and I shared. By facing that challenge together, we learned how to support each other more openly and how to recognize the difference between advice that helps and influence that harms. As time passed, our marriage grew stronger because the experience had forced us to clarify what truly mattered: respect, honesty, and the commitment to face every challenge as a united team. And in the end, the attempt to weaken our relationship had done the opposite. It had reminded both of us why we chose each other in the first place and why the life we were building together would always remain stronger than any doubt placed in our path.